The Timucua Indians. Florida's Black Native Americans. Background, official sources, National Park Service, etc. Their story officially resides in northeastern and north central Florida. Today, they have sites that pay homage to them, known as the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve. They possibly date back to 3000 BC. Their population may have been in the hundreds of thousands, according to the National Park Service. Around 200 to 300,000. Other sources, like the Peach State Archaeological Society.org, give numbers ranging from 50,000 to 200,000. Timucua, their name, could be a Spanish-derived pronunciation. In their language, the meaning Atomicua translate as Lord or Chief. Like many other Native American groups, they grew beans, corn, and squash, along with other staples. They are believed to have been semi-nomads. They lived in fortified villages where they practiced a caste system that was stratified, which heredity predestined the roles they would play in larger groups. They consisted of 35 chiefdoms and may have aligned or allied themselves with other tribes, though these affiliations are said to have been loose. Curiously, they knew something special about farming. They would cut large growths and then the same fields would be burned, thus clearing it. Next, the soil would be worked, effectively breaking up and turning over the dirt to blend together the nitrates from the ash into the soil. The nitrates in the ash would be mixed into the soil, rendering it an effective fertilizer. This farming knowledge is known today as slash and burn, or crop rotation. They lived off of berry picking, bread cooked from the kunti plants, root starch, alligators, maybe eastern bison, turkeys, shellfish / oyster collecting, fish, deer, and even bears. Meat would be cooked by either boiling or over a fire, a cooking style known as barbacoa, from which the word barbecue is said to have originated. Spanish contact. The Spanish came into the equation in the 1500s. St. Augustine was claimed by the Spanish crown in 1513 by Juan Ponce de Leon, along with the entire eastern side of North America. He also gave the territory its name, La Florida. Afterwards, Bonfilo de Narvaez, Spanish conquistador and explorer, landed in Tampa Bay around 1528 and proceeded an exploration into the outskirts of Timucua territory. That same year, Bonfilo and his men would meet their demise in a storm, they say, in an attempt to sail to Mexico by raft. Let's continue. The Spanish would prudently drop off pigs, cows, chickens, goats, and other animals during these visits to ensure a food source on return visits. The Spanish and the Timucua butted heads. They fought 2 battles, which ended with the loss of hundreds of Timucua lives. Although it wasn't one-sided, these clashes cost the lives of Spaniards in the hundreds as well. For instance, the Spanish commander Pedro Mendez de Aviles terminated the French Fort Caroline, effectively renaming it San Mateo, around 1565. Sometime after this successful conquest, he spends a winter in Spain. Though while he's away from Florida, his soldiers somehow deteriorate the friendly relations they once held with the Timucua, possibly by antagonizing them, then killing 3 ranked allies of Chief Saturiwa, leading up to a capture of Spaniard Rodrigo Troche in March 1566, where Chief Saturiwa ordered the man's heart torn out of his living body. By May of 1566, Saturiwa had over 100 Spaniards killed. Unfortunately, these were not the only tragedies to befall the Spanish during this time. The Timucuas also burned down San Mateo Fort in St. Augustine, forcing the Spanish to relocate. Commander Mendez attributed this debacle to unruliness on behalf of the Spanish soldiers and a lack of food. What's mordant about all this is that these Indians succeeded in several ways at playing both the Spanish and the French at their own game, and would continue to do so. In fact, there'd be regular attacks on the Spanish initiated by the Timucuas. I just need to add that the way that I am pronouncing Timucua words are likely not the way that these Indians pronounced these words themselves. Because I'm a Spanish speaker, Chief Saturiwa just rolls off the tongue better. Let's continue. The Huguenots. Ironically, the Frenchmen, or the Huguenots in an alternative version of history, are the black Moors banished from Spain. And these Timucuans are believed to also be black. Yet the Huguenots try to employ conquest tactics on the Timucua and failed right out the gate. A yaunt. It's no wonder the Spanish had beef with the Huguenots, seeing as how they would have been enemies back in Spain. Spain was conquered by the Moors around the year 700, and the Moors reigned there up until 1492, after their last stronghold in Granada was captured. After completion of the Reconquista happened, Muslims and Jews could no longer practice their faith. Jews in Spain during this time were said to be outwardly Catholic, but in secret they would practice their faith. These people were known as crypto-Jews. Likewise, Muslims were also given an ultimatum to convert to Catholicism. Many, however, did not and fled to other parts of Europe or the New World, in this case in particular, the west of France and the south. But an in-depth look on that is a whole other story for an upcoming video. What can be extrapolated from this, though, is that no matter if one shares the same phonetic type or skin color, that does not necessarily form genuine kinship, loyalty, or allegiance. Everyone that has ever existed has always had ulterior motives, an agenda, wants, needs, desires, mood swings, hunger, ambitions, lust, anger, compassion, etc. False, preconceived notions. This notion that all these Indians were so easy to conquer, or that they had inferior ways, that they were outclassed and never won any battles, is a one-sided myth. These people, the Timucua especially, were inquisitive, self-serving, sly, and opportunistic. Mankind has brains. Our brains aren't any smaller or larger outside of an individual's biology. Our bodies are built to bend our reality to our will. Our fingers, right, work tools. Our minds conceive. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We will continue to gain not just technology, but knowledge, and continue to push the limits of what's possible. Phenotype: French accounts, Spanish accounts. Officially, the Timucua were described as very tall, dark-skinned, with black hair. In fact, shockingly tall, standing 4 to 6 inches higher than the Spaniards, according to official sources. They also would rock a hair bun, they tattooed themselves, and seemingly by earning these tattoos through warfare or hunting. On the contrary, here is a quote from a historical document collection titled The French of Fort Caroline and the Timucua of Florida, published in 1591, detailing French expeditions to Florida under Jean Ribault in 1562 and René Boulain de Laudonnière or Laudonnière in 1564. And I quote,
"This chief, Ator, is an extremely handsome, intelligent, reliable, strong, of exceptional height, exceeding our tallest man by 1.5 feet, and endowed with a certain restrained dignity, so that in him a remarkable majesty shone forth. He arrived, or he married, his mother, and by her raised more children of both sexes, whom he produced for us, by slapping his thigh, and indeed, after she had been betrothed to him, his father Saturiwa did not touch her anymore."
Now, I wish this never even happened. Okay? I wish that I could have left that out. Right? But it was in there. Gross. Let's move on. Hunting was also one of their pastimes, along with archery and dancing. They wore animal skins or clothes derived from such. They too wore clothing made from moss. They'd fit deer skins over their bodies in a way to be able to see through the eye holes of the deer skin, so they can approach an unsuspecting deer drinking water by a river. So they can then shoot the creature with an arrow. After the kill, they masterfully worked such deer skins not with a metal blade or pieces of stone, but with shells. Modes of communication. Language. What is known about the early Timucuans comes from the French Huguenots, who arrived on the shores of Florida in 1562, fleeing persecution. The Huguenots wound up forging good relations with the locals after their aforementioned conflict. Unfortunately, their fate had altered a bit after encountering and establishing kinship with the French. The Spanish eliminated French settlements, establishing missions in their wake. The Indians were effectively proselytized, fitfully around the 1570s. A good thing that came out of this was a preservation of language, one of the few of such regional languages that survive. Much of the knowledge of this extinct tribe's language is based off of the translated religious texts from the Timucua to Spanish. In years 1612 and 1627, Father Francisco Pareja, a linguist and creator of the Timucua catechisms, did the work that served as a dictionary and description of the Timucua grammar. Now let's segue into source-derived material from a Smithsonian article. Check out the citation right here. Hundreds of years later, the understanding of the Timucua language was finally expanded upon. Around the year 2000, a graduate student at Berkeley, now a teacher at UC California Riverside, Alejandra Dubkovsky, Argentinian-born, and Aaron Broadwell, an American, who was at the time a linguistics professor at the University of Florida, teamed up and dissented new discoveries. Timucua were taught the Roman alphabet for Catholic purposes, though a missing piece is the role the Timucua had in the authorization of such texts. They discovered that Timucua were the ones putting together translations using the Roman alphabet. The sense behind this assertion is that a Spaniard wouldn't understand enough of this language to proofread. It's hard to learn such things, and also these natives weren't stupid enough to share everything with the missionaries. These mofos, in the most gobsmacking way, kept using the alphabet the Spanish taught them and that they've mastered to send each other letters in their own language for things like lamentations of the Spaniards' broken promises or water rights. 2 of such letters exist, one dated to 1651 and the second to 1688. These letters are the proof the Timucuas took and employed what they learned after their time with the priests were through. It's hard to believe the story of how these translations came about, along with a deeper look into all of this, took so long to achieve breakthroughs. And I have to pause right here. The capacity that human beings have for higher forms of thought is what makes us us. We have never been without technology or knowledge or imagination, understanding, and the list goes on. Due to their slightness, it's iffy whether or not these Indians embraced Christianity. Alejandra Dubkovsky says, and I quote,
"Do I think that indigenous people in the 16th century are fully converting and finding peace and salvation in this new faith? Absolutely. Do I also think that some people are skirting the line and trying to contain their own autonomy and spaces within that? Also, absolutely."
Broadwell added that some Timucua translators might have been wording the things extra carefully so as not to offend all the non-Christian members of their community.
End quote. This article goes on to ask why natives didn't come into forming a written language that only a handful of times did written language emerge in the past, like in Korea, Babylon, China, Mesoamerica, and that they weren't phonetic. Though just because a language doesn't have a writing system, it doesn't mean it's not an eloquently sophisticated one. Despite its uniqueness, it bears similarity to Choctaw, meaning these groups could have influenced each other or interacted. Mind-blowingly, these people, according to Alejandra, didn't actually go extinct. Rather, they were motivated or had to leave the region to avoid the fate of suffering or worse, death. Alejandra is convinced that most of them went south, with some descendants identifying as Cuban or African American. Holy shit. Here I was, doing my research, already knowing that folks have been saying these natives were black for a while, expecting the official sources to leave this part out. And here is a revered academic article and official source flat out saying that these people were black. Another thing that I want to add is a comment I seen and heard a hip-hop artist, Kevin Gates, say. Now, celebrities have phases. One day they're this, the next day they're something else, or they try to insert themselves into new ways to stay relevant. Setting that aside, Kevin said that he wears a feather because he considers himself a descendant of the Native Americans that were removed from the southeastern US into the Caribbean. In his case, Puerto Rico, because I do believe he is Puerto Rican. Lamentably, diseases brought by Europeans proved fatal to most Florida natives. Sadly, by 1700, the population is believed to have dwindled to a meager 1,000. Officially, they are said to have gone extinct. And perhaps they did in the sense that their culture, the practice of it, or their language was overridden by the larger native tribes that they could have been adopted into. Alternative historicities. Although some apocryphal takes have already been mentioned, an amalgam of other source material will too be presented. Chiefly from the book America is the True Old World, authored by Amenhotep El Bey. It's noteworthy to mention he proclaims to be well decorated and credible. Some of his credentials include philosopher, metaphysician, poet, etc. But the one credential that juts out most is his declaration, by his own admission, of being an honorary 33-degree Mason. Let's continue. The Timucua inhabited huge chunks of land that covered northeastern and parts of central Florida. For comparison, today the territory they covered encompassed cities like Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Callahan, Tampa, Orlando, and more. They were, according to Mr. Amenhotep, the first people to inhabit Florida. Dumbfoundingly, they were gigantic, ranging from 7 to 8 feet tall. Chief Saturiwa was actually so dark his tattoos weren't too visible. He was also a giant that stood 8 feet tall. He supposedly held principality over Florida. Plenty of sources corroborate official sources as it pertains to the relationship Chief Saturiwa built with the French Huguenots. The difference is why they formed a relationship and who the French Huguenots really were. Apparently, these two groups were both Moors and shared common ground in this way. Now, to grasp all of this, we must once again, but briskly, look into the heteroclite version of the French Huguenots. They were Moors, driven out of the Iberian Peninsula as a consequence of Spain's Reconquista. Fleeing persecution, they sought refuge in the south of France. Later on, they had developed some smoke with the Catholic Church. Around this time, the church committed sadistic acts of persecutions that the Huguenots loathed. The Huguenots would then immigrate from Europe to the New World, in particular, South Carolina. Side note, St. Augustine is the oldest city in America. Supposedly, it was founded in 1562 by the French Huguenot Captain Jean Ribault. Now, in 2025, it's actually a tourist attraction. Connections to the Timucua from all over Europe have been made by Mr. Amunhotep. One of these links is the regalia the Indians wore in comparison to the peoples of Europe, including, in this case, the Welsh, such as the Prince of Wales' feathers, or a heraldic badge for the prince consisting of 3 ostrich feathers that were encircled by a golden coronet. Okay? The supposed figurine of the Moor with the emerald cluster, otherwise known as Chief Saturiwa, may just be rocking such a headdress. What's really gripping is the heraldic motif is traced to Edward the Black Prince, who was around from years 1330 to 1376. He was the apparent heir to King Edward III of England. Now, there's a whole backstory behind this legend, a story for another time, but it must be mentioned a take behind his nickname is due to the color of armor that he wore, not his actual skin color. Now, allegedly, they were able to live the Timucua to 300 to 350 years due to a healthy diet, along with Florida's legendary fountains or fountain of youth. It's a spring located in St. Augustine. Here is another quote from the historical document collection titled The French of Fort Caroline and the Timucua of Florida.
Yet they are temperate in their eating, as a result of which they live for a long time. For one of their chiefs assured me that he was 300 years old, and his father, whom he showed me, was 50 years older than he. I could truly say that when I saw him, I thought I was looking at no more than human bones covered with skin. They certainly put Christians to shame, who reduced their span of life by holding immoderate feasts and drinking parties, and who deserve to be handed over for training to these base, uncivilized people and brutish creatures in order to learn restraint.
The Timucuans were described as Pictish, and women described as looking Irish, allegedly by the conquistador Hernan de Soto, due to the fact that groups painted their faces, right, and they tattooed their bodies. Hernan de Soto encountered these people around 1539 to 1540. Picts hailed from eastern and northeastern Scotland in ancient times. They may have gotten their name based on how they painted or pictured their bodies. The Picts were gypsy people. Allegedly, gypsy is short for Egyptian or Ethiopian because they are believed to have immigrated from these regions. A counter argument to this is that it's a mistranslation and or misconception stemming from medieval times, when the Gyptian was derived from the Greek word meaning Aegyptos, which meant Egyptian. It's said that the dark brown gypsies of Europe today officially descended from India. Anyhow, back when black people were referred to as Moor, possibly Picts, and definitely swarthy. The origins of the Timucua are unknown. Early explorers didn't record any mythology or folklore pertaining to the Timucua, so anthropologists and archaeologists have attempted to fill in some blanks via 4 conclusions. So the first one is Florida's culture developed from the north. Second one is in some way from Central America by way of the Gulf Coast. The third, by way of the Antilles through Central America. And the fourth, from the Mex.
The Moor with the emerald cluster.
Right, the primary source material that will be presented comes from an excerpt from the Metropolitan Museum Journal, Volume 15, dated 1980, titled The Graphic Sources for the Moor with the Emerald Cluster, Helmut Nickel, Curator of Arms and Armor. So it must be pointed out that there's other scholarly texts that have been published that deeply dive into this figurine. Some of them include The Color of Paradise, the Emerald in the Age of Gunpowder, Empires, authored by Chris Lane in 2010. There's another one that's titled in German. I can't read German, but you'll see it up on the screen. And the author is Kirsten, dated 2019-2020. Provenance and Meanings of Early Modern Emerald Matter, authored by Andres Velez in 2024. And so Andres is from Colombia, and I believe he is making the connection that this figurine has to Colombia. Another one is Ornamental Blackness, the Black Figure in European Decorative Arts by Adrian L. Childs, and this one is dated this year, 2025. Now, a thought-provoking article has purported a connection that this Moorish figure has with Latin American country of Colombia that I mentioned earlier. In fact, Colombia today is undisputably the largest producer of emeralds, even back in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And onward, Colombia has held this title. The Moor with the Emerald Cluster resides in the Green Vault in Dresden, Germany. It's a part of Dresden Castle. It's also a chamber of Europe's largest and most precious and historical treasures. Its location within the complex is featured in the Jewel Chamber, where it's displayed in a showcase. Its creation is primarily attributed to the sculptor Balthasar Permoser around 1724. Other craftsmen that are said to have worked on this piece include Wilhelm Kruger and jeweler, I believe it says Johann Melchior Dinglinger. It was carved out of pearwood and lacquered a chocolatey brown. The facial features are wide nose with full lips. The hair is covered by a golden feather crown, mentioned earlier, right? So we already kind of went through this. And on top of this crown, there's an opening where you could see his curly, kinky hair, right? It's visible, and it's clearly the hair of what we would consider today a black person's hair. Revealing is the skin, the Moor with the Emerald Cluster. It's covered with intricate tattoos, consisting of thousands of blue/black lacquer painted dots. And earlier, we went over the French accounts of the Timucua. And here is this figurine with intricate tattoos, right? Just like the Timucua were described as having by the French. So I'm going to put illustrations up, right, for comparison of the figurine and the French illustrations. This figurine was undeniably modeled after these illustrations from the French of these Native Americans in Florida. It's from the bracelets to the plate on the chest to the, the necklace, jewelry that they're wearing on their ankles, right? I believe there's armbands, just the whole shebang. And this doesn't mean that this is a depiction of Chief Saturiwa. What it undeniably proves is that this figurine was modeled after, right, Timucua, and they just so happened to make this figurine a black man. Noticeably, the Moor is rocking a gem-studded, jewelry-like plated necklace that covers a good portion of his chest. His lower extremities is covered by a skirt, possibly depicting a breechcloth. The tray he carries is a tortoiseshell. Therein a matrix of emeralds is flaunted. Now, the tray he's holding up is said to be actually an older piece, right? The cluster of emeralds was presented to Elector Augustus in 1553 or 86, sometime in between. The founder of the Dresden Kunstheimer in 1560. by his friend and Emperor Rudolph II in 1581 when he was paying a visit in Prague. After Rudolph recovered from illness, these emeralds were stored in a black-lined velvet box. Precious stones, unicorn, and rhinoceros horns was the section that they were cataloged under. Indies of the West is where they were said to have originated from, possibly from Muso in Colombia. The text goes on to say that the whole piece must have been crafted prior to 1725, when its documentation appeared in inventory. Surprisingly, little attention was paid to this work of art. Authorship was brought into question in 1879, and because of the complexity, I find it best to quote the source material for this, and I quote,
Thus, it seems that Johann Melchior Dinglinger, the celebrated court goldsmith of Augustus, the strong and the master of the most breathtaking objects of the art in the Green Vault, was thought to have been the carver of this figure too. It was not until 1950 that Jean-Louis Sponsel, in his guide to the collections, suggested that Balthasar Permoser, the sculptor, who was a close friend and collaborator of Dinglinger's, as the author of the figurine. Erna von Watzdorf, in her monogram in Dinglinger, 1962, attributes the Moor himself to Permoser, the tray and the pedestal to Ephraim Benjamin Kruger, a worker in ivory and tortoiseshell, and the jeweled mountings to Dinglinger's workshop. Joachim Menthausen, the present director of Green Vault, accepts the attribution to Permoser, but suggests that Wilhelm Krieger, the father of Ephraim Benjamin, as the carver of the tray and pedestal. In his monogram, Das Green Vault 1962, the jeweler of the Moor is attributed to Dinglinger's workshop. In the exhibition catalog, The Splendor of Dresden, Gerald Jerez and Werner Kiontik, who jointly wrote the entries for, says NOS 241306, attribute the mountings of the Moor, number 291, to Dinglinger. Erna von Watzdorf claims that the workmanship of the jeweler is a little too coarse for Dinglinger's own hand, particularly in comparison with the trappings of two small ebony statuettes by Permoser, blackamoors, carrying oyster shells with grown-in pearl clusters, which she takes to be the Moor's prototypes and models.
So a bombshell this article drops is that this carving was modeled after the illustrations of travel accounts from the French expeditions to Florida mentioned earlier, in order to depict an American Indian, specifically Chief Saturiwa. Lastly, another stupefying connection was made with the headdress or this crown this figure is wearing to the emperors of Mexico. The peculiarity of the feathered crown is purported to be a diadem of Mexican emperors, typically called copili or Huitzoli, a jewel-encrusted pointed peak. The Huitzoli was part of the name glyph of Montezuma's and is said to be found in countless 16th century illustrations identifying this monarch. Lastly, there is more than one Moorish Amerindian figurine, and also a look-alike called Orisha Shango. Check it out. Final thoughts. I suppose one could argue that just because a Moorish figurine was modeled after Chief Saturiwa, that wouldn't necessarily mean that this was indeed an actual depiction of him or any Timucua. Perhaps this figurine was made to be a hybrid work of art. Permoser and his collaborators could have intended to throw spectators off, or to mix in some sensationalism to attract onlookers. Who knows? Maybe they thought about what people would think in the future. They could have simply been tinkering around, or they could have been confused themselves. What can be concluded, right, is that a lot of evidence points towards the Timucua being black. That's what I am 90% sure of. Now, I'm leaving a little wiggle room for some error, but in general, there was and still is Native Americans with with all sorts of phenotypes and skin colors, because there has been migrations to the Americas from all sorts of different directions at different times for similar or distinct purposes. This premise ain't nothing new, right? People have been mulling over these stories for centuries already, from Jews to Egyptians to the Chinese and the Romans and the Greeks. They all have been linked to voyages to the New World.